The parables of Jesus can sometimes be hard to understand. One of the parables that has perplexed me for a really long time is the one that Jesus tells in Matthew 22, verses 1 through 14. It's the parable of the king's banquet. Like, what is Jesus talking about in this parable? So, in this video, I want to share with you a little clip from the weekly visual text study that we do at Cartoonist Bible Network. Now, this is a text study that's only available for network members. So if you'd like to get in on this every week, I'll put a link down below. You can do a 7-day free trial. And hey, members of the network get to download everything for free. It's pretty awesome. So this video, I'm gonna walk through some visual resources that are going to give you two different options for how we might interpret this perplexing parable. So let's dive in. So let me walk through this real quick. So this is the image that's from A Cartoonist Guide to Matthew, the most recent drawing. It's part of what we've been doing the last few weeks. But let's put this in context. So there's 4 things I'm going to do in this post. I'm going to give you context for where it falls in the big story. We're going to walk through the actual parable itself. And then I'm going to give you 2 options for how you might interpret this parable, because it's a perplexing parable, okay? And then I've got some final thoughts and a so what, like what do we do with this parable? So context is, let's remember, we got to go back to the beginning of Matthew chapter 21. This is, according to Matthew's telling of the story, this is the first time Jesus enters Jerusalem. This is the triumphal entry. He's coming in on the donkey. The people are shouting, "Lord, save us, Hosanna to the Son of David." And then Jesus clears the temple, flips the tables, and of course that's going to get the leaders' attention. So the chief priests and scribes come, and they're like, "What are you doing?" And he leaves. On his second day, so he's got 3 entries into Jerusalem. On his second entry, he comes in, and the people, the leaders, chief priests and Pharisees, ask him, "By what authority are you doing these things?" And this is where Jesus gives them 3 parables. Now, the first parable, if you remember from 2 weeks ago, parable of the 2 sons. One says yes and doesn't do it. The other says no and does it. Who's the better son? So he's setting up his listeners, who are his adversaries, the chief priests and Pharisees, with a 3-part punch, where the first 2 set up one thing, and what we're going to see is in this third parable is a great reversal. So in the first 2, he's like, logic is the better son is the one who actually does what he's supposed to do. Second parable from last week was the parable of the vineyard, where the tenants don't give the landowner what is due him. And the landowner has every right to kill the tenants, right? According to their rules. So now we come to this third parable. And the parable, so now here's illustrations I did back in 2015. And this is the part that I was excited to rediscover. So here's the story of the parable. You've got this king. So Jesus says to the leaders, the kingdom of God can be compared to a king. Now the king's son is getting married. So he throws this big wedding banquet and he invites everybody to the banquet. But the people ignore his invitation and they murder his messengers. Like, whoa. And so the king gets angry and he destroys he burns their city. And then he sends out his servants and invites everybody to the banquet. And everybody's there except one guy doesn't have the right clothes on. He's not dressed in the wedding banquet attire. And so the king gets mad and kills him, has him bound, dragged out, and executed. It's like, wow, Jesus, that's a really nice story. What are you trying to tell us? So here's 2 possible ways to interpret this. There's not only 2 interpretations, but here's 2 possible ways to interpret it. One is to think, okay, in this parable, the king represents God. Because in the second parable, the landowner seemed to be representing God, right? And Jesus was the son who was killed by the tenants, and that seemed to be. So you'd think that God is the king in this parable. And so, if that's where you want to start, then the parable would read like this: that God makes an invitation to Israel to participate in the kingdom of God, like has always been the case. When you go back to Isaiah, a vineyard planted to produce good fruit, but they reject God's invitation, and they actually murder the prophets, and eventually, murder the son. Well, the king gets angry. God gets angry over this and burns down. Israel is destroyed in AD 70. They're wiped out. Let's start a new banquet. And the new invitations are sent out, and these invitations go to Jews and Gentiles. And the clothing represents the clothing of righteousness, right? And we see in Paul's letter to the Colossians, where we have this language where we can associate it with this. As God's chosen ones, holy and beloved, clothe yourselves with compassion, right? So maybe that's what the wedding banquet clothes are representing. But then there's one person who doesn't have on the clothes of righteousness. And so God, like, nope, you're out. And so that person gets thrown out of the banquet. And this has been a way that this parable has been interpreted for a long time. And so the lesson of this parable then for us would be everyone is invited. So that's good news, right? It's not just Jews only, but it's Jews and Gentiles. But you better show up with the right clothes on, right? So that's kind of one way to interpret this parable. Now, another way to interpret this parable, I'm actually going to just read this so I don't get it wrong. So what if Jesus were actually referring to an historical event that happened in the city of Jerusalem that everybody would have known about when he was telling this parable? The way he opens the story is slightly different than his other parables, where he says, the kingdom of heaven is like. Here he says, the kingdom of heaven may be compared to a king. What if this is a parable of contrasts? This interpretation says that the king does not represent God, but represents Herod the Great. Back when Herod took over the city of Jerusalem, at that time, the Hasmonean family was the royal family of Israel and were the rightful heirs to the throne. There was a man named Antigonus who was from this family and was the king in Jerusalem for 3 years before Herod. We have to remember that all of this is taking place under the oppression of the Roman Empire. Herod was made the king of Israel by the Roman emperor, but the people of Jerusalem did not want to accept that. Herod came to the city of Jerusalem with an invitation. He was going to marry one of the Hasmonean women. This was the big wedding feast. He invited the people of Jerusalem to accept his marriage and to accept him as their king peacefully. Antigonus advised the people to ignore Herod. Others responded violently against him and murdered Herod's messengers. Well, Herod was not happy. This enraged Herod. He went off, married the woman, then returned with the Roman army and burned down the city of Jerusalem. This is all historical fact, okay? Then he took Jerusalem over by force and demanded the people accept him as their king. They were coerced into coming into the banquet. Herod then took over the temple and started rebuilding the city under his rule. All right? So if the parable that Jesus is telling is actually mirroring these historical events, then the people in the wedding clothes are being forced to wear the wedding clothes and to play and pay allegiance to this false king. Only one man stood up against Herod, Antigonus. He would not put on the wedding clothes. And so what did the king do? The king had him arrested, bound hand and foot, humiliated in front of the city, and then executed. This is all historical fact, right? So according to this interpretation, Jesus is identifying himself with Antigonus. And more importantly, he is identifying himself as the suffering servant from Isaiah. So Jesus is the man with no wedding robes. He confronts violent power structures as the suffering servant of Isaiah. And then Isaiah 53 says, he was despised and we held him of no account. Surely he has borne our infirmities and carried our diseases, yet we accounted him stricken, struck down by God and afflicted. But he was wounded for our transgressions, crushed for our iniquities. Upon him was the punishment that made us whole. We have all turned to our own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. And it says in the parable that the man without clothes was speechless. Isaiah 52 says, just as there were many that were astonished at him, so he shall startle many nations. Kings shall shut their mouths because of him. So the leaders asked Jesus, at the beginning of these three parables, the leaders asked Jesus, by what authority do you do these things? Jesus points out that the way people usually run kingdoms is through power plays, violence, and fear. Jesus takes that system and turns it upside down. He takes all the violence of the system, all the sin and fear and hatred, and he takes it upon himself. He allows himself to be crushed. He is thrown out into utter darkness where there is weeping and gnashing of teeth. And that is Jesus' authority. So option B, you are invited to follow Jesus as the one without the wedding clothes that bows down to the puppet king of Rome, right? Isn't that interesting? So what? Which option seems more like good news? Well, depends on what you mean by good news. But which is more aligned with the message that Jesus has been preaching throughout his entire ministry about who God is and what the kingdom of heaven is like? The bottom line, though, is that both interpretations actually ask us the same thing. You are invited into the kingdom of heaven. So no matter how you slice it, the way to the kingdom is to follow the way of Jesus. His way led to the cross, where he laid down his life for us. When we realize that the world is upside down and we have to die to its lust for power, its violence, and its hatred, then we can be ready to live the new life that Jesus gives.
Hey, thanks for watching. I hope that you found that video as interesting for you as it was fun for me to make and to do. Hey, I would love to have you join us at Cartoonist Bible Network. Again, that is a network that is a place where people who are interested in visual learning and visual communication, specifically around the Bible, but also around theology and spiritual formation. It's a place for us to get together, to share our resources, to learn together about visual learning and communication. And it's a place where every week I get to share my visual resources with you. And so members of the network can download all of my resources for free. So I hope you'll consider joining, but at the very least, subscribe to my YouTube channel, share this with your friends, and we'll see you next time.